There's a photograph from 1901 that most Americans have never seen. It shows American soldiers in the Philippines standing around a Filipino prisoner lying on the ground. The prisoner's stomach is grotesquely distended, swollen like a balloon. The soldiers are smiling. Some are holding buckets. One has his foot positioned over the prisoner's stomach. What this photograph documents is a torture technique that American soldiers used routinely during the Philippine-American War, a technique they called the water cure. Today we call it waterboarding, and the debates about whether it constitutes torture echo debates that happened over a century ago. But in 1900, American soldiers weren't debating. They were doing it, writing about it in letters home, testifying about it in courts martial, and describing it with casual brutality in newspaper interviews. This is the story of how American soldiers tortured Filipino prisoners and civilians with water, how they justified it, how news of it reached the American public, and why it matters today. The water cure emerged during the Philippine-American War, a conflict that lasted officially from 1899 to 1902, but continued in some areas until 1913. To understand why American soldiers resorted to torture, you need to understand the nature of the war they were fighting. After the United States took the Philippines from Spain in 1898, Filipino revolutionaries who had been fighting for independence from Spain found themselves fighting a new colonial power. The Filipinos, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had expected American support for their independence. Instead, America decided to keep the Philippines as a colony. When war broke out in February 1899, the U.S. military initially fought conventional battles against the Filipino army and won easily with superior firepower and logistics. But winning battles didn't end the war. By late 1899, Filipino forces had shifted to guerrilla tactics. They avoided direct confrontation with American forces, instead launching ambushes, attacking supply lines, striking isolated garrisons, and then melting back into the civilian population. This was classic insurgent warfare, and it frustrated American forces tremendously. The guerrillas had the support of the Filipino population. Villagers fed them, sheltered them, warned them of American patrols, and refused to provide information to American forces. From the American perspective, they controlled the towns during the day, but the countryside belonged to the guerrillas. They couldn't tell who was a guerrilla and who was just a farmer. The man plowing a field might have a rifle buried in his hut. The woman selling vegetables in the market might be passing messages to the resistance. American soldiers, most of them volunteers from Western states who had signed up expecting a quick adventure, found themselves stuck in a frustrating, deadly conflict they didn't understand. They were dying from tropical diseases. They were being killed in ambushes. They couldn't get reliable intelligence about guerrilla movements or weapons caches, and they were under pressure from their commanders to pacify their assigned areas, to stop the attacks, to produce results. This was the context in which torture emerged, not as an official policy handed down from Washington, but as a field expedient that spread from unit to unit as soldiers shared what worked. The water cure itself was simple and required no special equipment. A prisoner or someone suspected of being a guerrilla or of knowing where guerrillas were hiding would be held down on the ground or tied to a ladder or bench. His mouth would be forced open, sometimes by pressing a bamboo stick against his teeth or simply by punching him until he opened his mouth. Then water would be poured down his throat. Not a little water, gallons and gallons of water. The prisoner would be forced to swallow as much as he could, and when he couldn't swallow any more, the water would be poured into his nose and throat anyway, forcing its way into his lungs and stomach. The prisoner's stomach would swell enormously. Accounts describe men whose stomachs became distended to 2 or 3 times normal size, stretched so tight the skin looked ready to burst. The prisoner would be choking, drowning, unable to breathe, in absolute agony. And then, when his stomach couldn't hold any more water, the soldiers would force the water out. Sometimes they would beat on the prisoner's stomach with their fists. Sometimes they would kneel on it. Sometimes they would jump on it. The water would come rushing out of the prisoner's mouth and nose, often mixed with blood from internal damage, and the prisoner would vomit and choke and gasp for air. And then, if he hadn't provided the information the soldiers wanted, they would do it again, and again, and again, until he talked or until they decided he didn't know anything or until he died. This wasn't an occasional aberration. It was systematic and widespread. American soldiers wrote about the water cure in letters home with shocking casualness. They described it like it was just another unpleasant task, like digging latrines or standing guard duty. One soldier wrote to his family describing how they gave a prisoner the water cure until his body became so distended that water was forced out of his pores. Another soldier described administering the water cure to a group of prisoners, forcing them to drink water until they could hold no more, then making them run until they vomited everything up, and then doing it again. Another described kneeling on a prisoner's stomach after the water cure, bouncing up and down, and watching water mixed with blood shoot out of the man's mouth like a geyser. The soldiers had different methods and variations. Some used salt water, which was more painful and more likely to make the prisoner vomit. Some used dirty water from rivers or rice paddies. Some added something to make the water taste foul. The basic principle was always the same. Fill a person with more water than the human body can possibly hold, causing extreme physical distress and the sensation of drowning to force them to provide information. It was torture, pure and simple, and everyone involved knew it was torture. They called it the water cure as a kind of dark joke, using medical language to describe something that was the opposite of healing. American officers generally knew the water cure was happening. Some explicitly ordered it. Some participated in it themselves. Others looked the other way, following a policy of don't ask, don't tell. The official rules said prisoners should be treated humanely according to the laws of war. But there was a huge gap between what the rules said and what actually happened in the field. Officers faced pressure to produce results, to get intelligence about guerrilla activities, to pacify their areas. If torture produced intelligence that prevented American casualties, many officers were willing to tolerate it or even encourage it, whatever the official rules said. Some units developed reputations for being particularly brutal. The soldiers often talked about which officers were strict about following the rules and which ones let soldiers do whatever worked. Some commanders explicitly told their men that they didn't want to know the details of how they got information. This gave soldiers implicit permission to use whatever methods they wanted. Other commanders were more direct, making it clear that they expected results and didn't care how those results were achieved. The justifications American soldiers gave for using the water cure are revealing. They said the Filipinos were savages who didn't fight by civilized rules, so the normal rules of war didn't apply. They said guerrilla warfare was inherently uncivilized, that ambushing patrols and refusing to wear uniforms and hiding among civilians meant the guerrillas had forfeited any right to humane treatment. They said the water cure wasn't really torture because it didn't cause permanent physical damage. It was just water, after all. The prisoner would recover within a few hours or a day. They contrasted it with what they claimed were Filipino torture methods, saying the Filipinos would mutilate prisoners and the water cure was humane by comparison. They also justified it in practical terms. They said it worked, that it saved American lives by providing intelligence about planned attacks or weapons caches. They said it was necessary in a war where the enemy wore no uniforms and could be anyone. They said that when Americans were being killed by guerrillas who then disappeared into the population, you had to use harsh methods to get information. Some soldiers explicitly compared the situation to fighting Native Americans on the frontier, saying the Filipinos were like Indians and had to be dealt with in the same way. This comparison was deliberate and telling. It placed Filipinos outside the category of civilized peoples who deserved humane treatment, just as Native Americans had been. But the water cure wasn't just used on captured guerrilla fighters. It was used on civilians, on village leaders who were suspected of supporting the guerrillas, on anyone who might have information. There are documented cases of the water cure being administered to priests, to village mayors, to elderly men, to teenagers. Sometimes it was used to extract intelligence. Sometimes it was used to force villagers to reveal where they had hidden food or weapons. Sometimes it was used simply as punishment to terrorize a village that was suspected of supporting the guerrillas. And sometimes it was used just because soldiers could, because they had power over these people and faced no meaningful consequences for abusing that power. The physical effects of the water cure were severe. In the short term, it caused extreme pain, the sensation of drowning, damage to the lungs from inhaled water, damage to internal organs from the extreme distension of the stomach, and often unconsciousness. Many prisoners vomited blood afterward. Some died during the process, either from drowning when water filled their lungs, from internal injuries when their stomachs were compressed, or from shock and trauma. Those who survived the water cure often suffered lasting effects. There are accounts of prisoners who couldn't eat solid food for days or weeks afterward because of damage to their digestive systems. Some developed chronic lung problems from aspirating water. The psychological trauma was also severe. Men who had been subjected to the water cure described ongoing nightmares and terror of water. The legal status of the water cure was ambiguous at the time. The international laws of war, as codified in documents like the Hague Convention, required humane treatment of prisoners and prohibited torture. But these rules were seen as applying mainly to conflicts between civilized nations. The United States had signed the Hague Convention, but many American officers and soldiers believed it didn't fully apply to conflicts with non-white peoples who they saw as uncivilized. There was also the question of whether Filipino fighters qualified as legitimate combatants entitled to the protections of the laws of war. The U.S. government officially classified the conflict as an insurrection, not a war, which meant in the government's view, the Filipinos weren't enemy soldiers, but rebels against lawful authority. This classification was used to argue that the full protections of international law didn't apply. The U.S. military's own regulations, based on the Liber Code from the Civil War, prohibited torture and required humane treatment of prisoners. But these regulations were often ignored in the Philippines, and enforcement was inconsistent at best. The military justice system did court-martial some soldiers and officers for using the water cure and other abuses, but these prosecutions were relatively rare. The sentences were usually light, and they did little to stop the practice. News of the water cure began reaching the American public in 1900 and 1901. Soldiers' letters describing it were published in hometown newspapers. Veterans returning home told stories about what they had seen and done. Anti-imperialist organizations seized on these accounts as proof that the war in the Philippines was corrupting American values and turning American soldiers into war criminals. In 1902, the Senate Committee on the Philippines held hearings investigating allegations of atrocities, and testimony about the water cure became a major focus. One of the most damning testimonies came from a soldier named Charles Riley, who had served in the Philippines and returned to the United States. Riley testified in detail about the water cure and other atrocities he had witnessed. He described specific incidents with dates and places. He named officers who had ordered or permitted the torture. His testimony was credible and specific, and it was hard for the military to dismiss or explain away. Other soldiers testified similarly, describing the water cure as routine practice that everyone knew about. Some officers tried to justify or minimize the practice when questioned. They testified that the water cure was necessary to get information that saved American lives. They said it wasn't really torture because it caused no permanent injury. They said it was traditional in the Philippines, that Filipinos used it on each other, so American forces were just adopting a local method. This last claim was particularly cynical. Even if it were true that some Filipinos used water torture, which was disputed, that wouldn't make it acceptable for American forces to use it. But the claim served to shift blame and make it seem like Americans were just adapting to local conditions rather than introducing torture. General Arthur MacArthur, who commanded U.S. forces in the Philippines for a crucial period and was the father of the more famous Douglas MacArthur, gave testimony that acknowledged harsh methods were used but defended them as necessary in fighting guerrillas. He described guerrilla warfare as inherently cruel and said that fighting it required harsh countermeasures. He suggested that critics who had never faced guerrilla warfare couldn't understand the necessities of the situation. This argument that conditions in the field justified extreme measures that would be unacceptable in normal circumstances became the standard defense. The Senate hearings created a public scandal. Anti-imperialist newspapers ran detailed stories about the water cure with graphic illustrations. Editorial cartoons showed American soldiers administering the water cure while standing under an American flag, the implicit message being that torture betrayed American values. Mark Twain, who was already a fierce critic of American imperialism, wrote scathing essays about the water cure. He suggested that America should redesign its flag to make it appropriate for a nation that tortured people, perhaps replacing the stars with skulls. The scandal contributed to growing public disillusionment with the Philippine War, though it didn't end the war or lead to significant changes in how it was conducted. The military's response to the scandal was a mixture of denial, justification, and selective prosecution. Some officers and soldiers were court-martialed for using the water cure, but the punishments were generally light. Major Edwin Glenn was tried and convicted for using the water cure on a Filipino priest. His sentence was a 1-month suspension and a $50 fine. That was the punishment for torture. Lieutenant Julian Gorgot was tried for administering the water cure to a prisoner who died. He was acquitted. The message these trials sent was clear. Torture might technically be against the rules, but it wouldn't be seriously punished. The most prominent court-martial related to atrocities in the Philippines was that of General Jacob Smith, who commanded operations on Samar Island after a devastating guerrilla attack on American forces in the town of Balangiga. Smith gave orders to turn Samar into a howling wilderness and reportedly told his officers to kill everyone over the age of 10. While Smith was court-martialed and convicted, his punishment was just forced retirement. He served no prison time. The general who ordered mass killing received a slap on the wrist. The trials were essentially for show, to demonstrate that the military was taking the atrocities seriously, while actually doing very little to punish those responsible or prevent future abuses. The water cure scandal also revealed deep divisions in American society. Pro-imperialist voices defended the practice or minimized its severity. They argued that critics were undermining American soldiers and encouraging the enemy. They said the soldiers were doing their best in difficult circumstances and shouldn't be second-guessed by people sitting safely at home. They suggested that anti-imperialists were exaggerating the extent and severity of the water cure for political purposes. Some went so far as to argue that the water cure wasn't torture at all, just a rough but effective interrogation method. These arguments sound eerily familiar to anyone who followed debates about enhanced interrogation techniques during the War on Terror a century later. Anti-imperialists, on the other hand, seized on the water cure as evidence that imperialism was corrupting America and turning American soldiers into torturers. They argued that a republic founded on principles of liberty and human rights couldn't maintain an empire without betraying those principles. They said the water cure showed that the civilizing mission Americans claimed to be conducting in the Philippines was a fraud, that America was bringing torture and brutality, not civilization. They argued that the casual acceptance of torture by many soldiers and officers showed that imperial warfare degraded everyone involved. These arguments didn't carry the day politically. The United States kept the Philippines, but they represented a significant moral critique of American imperialism. The racial dimensions of the water cure were impossible to ignore. American soldiers used the same racial slurs for Filipinos that they used for African Americans and Native Americans. They explicitly saw Filipinos as racially inferior, as barely human, as savages. This racism made torture psychologically easier. It's much harder to torture someone you see as fully human, as fundamentally like yourself, than to torture someone you've been taught to see as inferior and less than human. The racial attitudes of American soldiers in the Philippines were products of their society. The United States in 1900 was in the midst of Jim Crow, of systematic oppression of African Americans, of the final stages of the Indian Wars, of Chinese exclusion. The casual racism and dehumanization that made lynching possible at home made torture possible in the Philippines. Some African American soldiers served in the Philippines, and their experiences with the water cure were particularly complex. Black soldiers served in segregated units and faced discrimination from their white fellow soldiers even as they fought alongside them. Some African American soldiers recognized parallels between the treatment of Filipinos and the treatment of black people in America. A few deserted and fought for the Filipinos. But most remained loyal and participated in the same operations, including the water cure, as white soldiers. The racism that enabled torture affected everyone, including its victims who internalized the hierarchies of race and empire. The water cure also had a gendered dimension. It was almost exclusively used on men, reflecting assumptions about who had useful military intelligence and who could be subjected to physical torture. Women were subjected to other forms of abuse and violence, but the water cure was primarily a male experience. This reflected broader patterns of how gendered violence works in warfare, with men subjected to certain kinds of violence and women to others, though all ultimately serving to terrorize and control populations. The impact of the water cure on Filipino society was profound. Villages where the water cure was used routinely lived in terror. People knew that if American soldiers came looking for information about guerrillas, someone would be tortured. This created intense pressure on communities. Some villages gave up guerrillas or revealed weapons caches to avoid torture. Others remained loyal to the resistance despite the threat. The water cure created divisions within communities, between those who collaborated to avoid torture and those who refused. These divisions lasted long after the war ended. The water cure also became part of Filipino collective memory of American occupation. Stories of torture were passed down through generations. They became part of the national narrative about the struggle for independence. While the Philippines eventually developed close ties with the United States, and many Filipinos emigrated to America, the memory of American torture during the war remained a complicating factor in that relationship. It was a reminder that the special relationship between the two countries began with conquest and brutality, not with the benevolent aid that American official narratives preferred to emphasize. In the United States, the water cure was largely forgotten after the initial scandal. The Philippines became an American colony, and eventually the stories of how that colony was acquired faded from public consciousness. Most Americans today have never heard of the water cure in the Philippine-American War, but the practice didn't entirely disappear. During World War II, Japanese forces used water torture on American and Filipino prisoners, though they used different specific methods. After the war, during the Tokyo war crimes trials, water torture was prosecuted as a war crime. Japanese officers were convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms for waterboarding prisoners. This established an important precedent. Water torture was a war crime when others did it to Americans. The water cure returned to public consciousness after September 11, 2001, when the United States began using waterboarding in its interrogation of terrorism suspects. The CIA waterboarded prisoners held in secret prisons. The technique was the same as the water cure, forcing water into someone's mouth and nose to create the sensation of drowning. The debates about waterboarding echoed the debates from a century earlier. Defenders argued it wasn't torture because it caused no permanent physical damage, that it was necessary to get intelligence to prevent attacks, that the enemy didn't fight by civilized rules, so extreme measures were justified. Critics said it was torture, that it violated American and international law, that it didn't produce reliable intelligence, and that it betrayed American values. The historical amnesia about the water cure in the Philippines made these debates more difficult. If Americans had remembered that their soldiers had used this same technique a century ago, if they had remembered the scandal it caused, and the courts-martial that resulted, they might have been better equipped to evaluate claims about waterboarding. The fact that Japanese officers were prosecuted for waterboarding American prisoners in World War II should have settled the question of whether waterboarding is torture. But because the history wasn't widely known, the debate could start from scratch, as if this were a new technique with no historical precedent. In 2014, the Senate Intelligence Committee released a report on CIA torture, and waterboarding was a central focus. The report documented that waterboarding had been used extensively, that it often didn't produce useful intelligence, that prisoners gave false information just to make it stop, and that the psychological and physical damage was severe. The report essentially confirmed what was known about the water cure a century earlier. Torture doesn't work reliably, it traumatizes both victims and perpetrators, and it corrupts institutions that use it. But the report also showed that the lessons of the Philippine-American War had not been learned, or had been forgotten, or had been deliberately ignored by officials who wanted to use torture despite its history. Understanding the water cure in the Philippines helps us understand several important things about torture more generally. First, torture usually emerges not from explicit policy, but from field conditions where soldiers or interrogators face pressure to produce results, where they see the enemy as less than human, and where they face no meaningful consequences for abuse. The water cure wasn't ordered from Washington. It spread from unit to unit in the Philippines as soldiers shared techniques that seemed to work. This is how torture proliferates, through informal networks, justified by necessity, enabled by dehumanization. Second, torture is sustained by euphemism. Calling it the water cure rather than torture made it easier for soldiers to do and easier for commanders to tolerate. Similarly, enhanced interrogation techniques sounds less brutal than torture, and that linguistic shift made it easier for the Bush administration to authorize waterboarding. The words we use matter because they shape how we think about actions. Call something medical or technical, and it seems less like brutality. Third, torture is enabled by racism and dehumanization. The water cure was possible because American soldiers didn't see Filipinos as fully human. They saw them as savages, as inferior beings who didn't deserve the same treatment as white prisoners would receive. This pattern repeats whenever torture is used. The victims are almost always people who are seen as other, as outside the circle of full humanity. In the War on Terror, the victims were Muslims, often Arabs, people who were easy for many Americans to see as foreign and threatening, and less than fully human. The casual prejudice that enables lynching or police brutality at home enables torture abroad. Fourth, torture rarely produces reliable intelligence. Prisoners subjected to the water cure often told their interrogators whatever they thought the interrogators wanted to hear, just to make the torture stop. They gave up innocent people as guerrillas. They revealed non-existent weapons caches. They invented plans and conspiracies. The intelligence gained from torture was notoriously unreliable, a point that American officers in the Philippines acknowledged when pressed, and a point that was confirmed again in the CIA torture program. People will say anything to stop pain, which means torture doesn't distinguish between true information and false information. Fifth, torture corrupts institutions and individuals. The American soldiers who routinely used the water cure became casual about cruelty. They wrote home about torture as if it were amusing. They joked about it. They competed to see who could make a prisoner's stomach swell the largest. This casual brutality didn't stay in the Philippines. These men brought home with them the psychological damage of having tortured people, the moral injury of having done things they knew were wrong, and the capacity for violence that torture awakens. The same is true for the interrogators and officials involved in the CIA torture program. Torture damages everyone involved. The water cure in the Philippines also shows the limits of accountability. Despite courts-martial, despite public scandal, despite clear evidence that torture was systematic and widespread, almost no one faced serious consequences. The punishments were light. The officers who enabled or encouraged torture mostly continued their careers. The institutional structures that allowed torture to happen remained in place. This lack of accountability sent a message that torture might be officially prohibited, but was effectively permitted. The same pattern played out after the War on Terror. Despite extensive documentation of torture, despite admissions that waterboarding occurred, despite the Senate report, almost no one was prosecuted. A handful of low-ranking soldiers were punished for abuses at Abu Ghraib, but the architects of the torture program faced no legal consequences. The lack of accountability for the water cure in the Philippines set a precedent that would be followed a century later. There's also the question of how torture affects military effectiveness and strategic success. The water cure didn't end the Philippine insurrection quickly. It didn't lead to rapid pacification of the islands. Instead, it likely prolonged the conflict by creating more enemies. When American soldiers tortured someone from a village, they created grievances that fed the resistance. They gave the guerrillas a powerful recruiting tool. They made reconciliation harder. The same pattern appeared in the War on Terror, where torture at Abu Ghraib and elsewhere became a propaganda tool for terrorist organizations and damaged America's relationships with Muslim populations worldwide. Torture might produce some tactical intelligence, though often unreliable, but it undermines strategic goals by creating enemies and delegitimizing the user. The cultural transmission of torture techniques is also worth examining. The water cure wasn't invented in the Philippines. Forms of water torture had existed for centuries, used by various governments and organizations. The Spanish Inquisition used water torture. Various European monarchies used it. When American soldiers arrived in the Philippines, some claimed they were just adopting a technique that Filipinos already used, though this was disputed and seemed mainly an attempt at justification. More likely, soldiers brought knowledge of water torture from various sources and adapted it to their circumstances. Once introduced, the technique spread rapidly through informal channels as soldiers transferred between units and shared information about what worked. This is how torture techniques propagate, not usually through official training manuals, but through informal knowledge sharing among people who have used it. The same pattern occurred with waterboarding in the War on Terror. The technique was taught in seared training, where American military personnel learned to resist torture by experiencing simulated versions of techniques that enemies might use. Some of the psychologists and officials who designed the CIA interrogation program had backgrounds in seared training. They reverse-engineered the resistance training, taking techniques that were used to teach Americans to withstand torture and using them to torture others. The water cure from the Philippines wasn't directly transmitted to the CIA program, but the same basic technique persisted across a century because it's simple, requires no special equipment, and is devastatingly effective at causing terror and pain. The medical involvement in torture is another consistent pattern. In the Philippines, military doctors sometimes treated prisoners after water cure sessions, patching them up so they could be tortured again. In the CIA program, medical personnel monitored waterboarding sessions, ostensibly to ensure the prisoner didn't die, but effectively enabling torture to continue. The involvement of medical professionals in torture represents a profound betrayal of medical ethics, but it happens repeatedly because torture programs need medical expertise to keep victims alive, and because they seek medical authority to legitimize what they're doing. Having a doctor present creates the illusion that the procedure is controlled and safe, that it's more like a medical intervention than torture, though of course it remains torture regardless of medical presence. The role of bureaucracy in torture is also significant. In the Philippines, officers filed reports and kept records. Some of these records documented the use of the water cure, though usually in euphemistic language. The military bureaucracy processed this information, creating a paper trail that later enabled Senate investigations, but also showing how institutions can process and normalize atrocities through routine administrative procedures. In the CIA torture program, extensive records were kept, including video recordings of waterboarding sessions, though many of these were later destroyed. The memos authorizing enhanced interrogation techniques, written by Justice Department lawyers, show how legal bureaucracy can be used to provide a veneer of legitimacy for torture, crafting careful arguments that waterboarding doesn't technically meet the legal definition of torture, even though everyone involved knew it was torture. The psychological processes that enable individuals to torture are worth examining. Most people have a natural reluctance to cause extreme suffering to others. How do ordinary people overcome that reluctance? The answer involves several factors that were present in the Philippines and are present wherever torture occurs. First, authorization from authority figures. Soldiers used the water cure partly because they believed, rightly or wrongly, that their officers approved or at least wouldn't punish them. Experiments like the Milgram experiment have shown how powerful authority can be in getting people to harm others. Second, dehumanization of victims. Seeing Filipinos as savages made it psychologically easier to torture them. Third, gradual escalation. Soldiers didn't usually start with torture. They started with rougher interrogations, then moved to more severe tactics, each step making the next step easier. Fourth, peer pressure and group dynamics. If everyone in your unit uses the water cure, it becomes normalized, and there's pressure to conform. Fifth, the stress and fear of combat. Soldiers who had seen comrades killed in guerrilla ambushes were angry and wanted revenge, and torture provided an outlet for that rage. These same psychological factors operated in the CIA torture program. Interrogators received authorization from higher authority. Prisoners were dehumanized as terrorists. The escalation was gradual, starting with sleep deprivation and stress positions before moving to waterboarding. The small group of people involved in the program reinforced each other, and the fear generated by September 11 created a climate where extreme measures seemed justified. Understanding these psychological processes is crucial for preventing torture, because it shows that ordinary people in certain circumstances can become torturers, and that preventing torture requires creating institutional and cultural barriers against these processes. The question of whether torture ever works in getting useful information remains contested. Defenders of torture, whether in the Philippines or in the War on Terror, claim it saved lives by providing intelligence that prevented attacks. Critics say torture produces unreliable information and that better results can be achieved through rapport-based interrogation methods that don't involve torture. The evidence suggests critics are right. Countless intelligence and interrogation professionals have testified that torture doesn't work, that prisoners will say anything to stop pain, and that the best intelligence comes from building relationships with prisoners and using psychological techniques that don't involve physical abuse. But the mythology that torture works persists, partly because of its portrayal in popular culture, partly because it provides a simple answer to the complex problem of how to get information from unwilling subjects, and partly because people want to believe that extreme measures are sometimes necessary and effective. In the specific case of the water cure in the Philippines, there's little evidence it was militarily decisive. The intelligence it produced was often wrong. The resentment it created strengthened the resistance. The guerrilla war eventually ended not because of torture, but because of a combination of military pressure, political reforms, capture of key leaders, and simple exhaustion. The water cure didn't win the war. It just made the war more brutal and more traumatic for everyone involved. The same appears to be true for waterboarding in the War on Terror. The few specific examples that defenders cite of useful intelligence gained from waterboarding have been extensively disputed, with many interrogation professionals saying the same information could have been obtained through non-torture methods and would likely have been more reliable. The long-term consequences of torture extend far beyond the immediate victims. The water cure in the Philippines contributed to anti-American sentiment that lasted for generations. It became part of the historical memory of American imperialism in Asia. It influenced how people in the Philippines and elsewhere viewed American power and American claims to moral authority. Similarly, the torture in the War on Terror damaged America's international reputation, strengthened terrorist propaganda, and created lasting problems for American foreign policy. Torture produces enemies not just among those tortured, but among everyone who hears about it and sees it as unjust and brutal. The short-term intelligence gains, if any, are vastly outweighed by the long-term strategic costs. There's also the domestic cost. When a nation embraces torture, even temporarily, even in supposedly exceptional circumstances, it changes that nation's character. The casual acceptance of the water cure by many Americans in 1900 reflected and reinforced broader patterns of racism and imperialism. It made it easier to accept other atrocities. It established precedents that would be used to justify later abuses. The acceptance of waterboarding in the War on Terror similarly changed American politics and culture, normalizing discussions of torture, creating debates about whether torture could be acceptable in certain circumstances, and establishing precedents that future governments could exploit. Once torture becomes thinkable, once it becomes something we debate rather than something we absolutely reject, we've already moved toward becoming a nation that tortures, with all the moral and practical consequences that follow. The treatment of whistleblowers and those who expose torture is also instructive. In the Philippines, soldiers who testified about the water cure in the Senate hearings faced retaliation from their fellow soldiers and from their communities. They were called traitors, accused of undermining the military, and often found their careers damaged. The message was clear: speaking out against torture would be punished. In the War on Terror, the pattern repeated. People who exposed torture or opposed it often faced retaliation. Career prospects suffered. Security clearances were revoked. Some faced prosecution. The institutions that practiced torture protected themselves by punishing dissenters, creating incentives for silence and complicity. Understanding the water cure also requires understanding how memory works, both individual and collective. The soldiers who administered the water cure had to find ways to live with what they'd done. Some convinced themselves it wasn't really torture, just a necessary technique. Some told themselves that saving American lives justified the means. Some simply compartmentalized, separating their war experiences from their peacetime identity. Some were haunted by what they'd done. The letters soldiers wrote home show all these responses. Some describe the water cure with casual humor. Others show more uneasiness, defensiveness, a need to justify. We don't have many accounts from soldiers late in life, looking back on their actions in the Philippines, but the accounts we do have suggest that many carried guilt and trauma related to what they'd done. Collective memory works differently. Societies choose what to remember and what to forget, and the water cure was largely forgotten in American collective memory. It's not taught in schools. It's not memorialized. It's not part of the stories Americans tell about their history. This forgetting is itself revealing, showing how uncomfortable truths get buried, how nations prefer heroic narratives to complicated ones that include torture and atrocity. The Philippines remembered differently, incorporating the water cure into narratives of resistance and victimization under American occupation. These different memories reflect different national needs and different positions in the power structure that created the torture in the first place. The legal framework around torture has evolved significantly since the Philippine-American War, though problems persist. After World War II, the international community created new laws prohibiting torture. The Geneva Conventions required humane treatment of prisoners. The Convention Against Torture, adopted in 1984, absolutely prohibited torture under any circumstances. The United States signed and ratified these treaties, making them part of American law. In theory, this should prevent the recurrence of something like the water cure. In practice, the waterboarding program showed that these legal protections can be evaded through creative legal arguments, semantic games, and simple disregard for the law when powerful people decide extreme measures are necessary. The law matters, but it's not sufficient without cultural commitment to upholding it and institutional structures that enforce it. The role of the press and public opinion in exposing torture and creating accountability is also crucial. In the Philippines, it was newspapers publishing soldiers' letters and testimony from the Senate hearings that created the public scandal around the water cure. The press, particularly the anti-imperialist press, played a vital role in ensuring Americans knew what was being done in their name. In the War on Terror, it was journalists who exposed the existence of secret prisons, who obtained the torture memos, who kept the story alive despite government efforts to suppress it. The Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture, though heavily redacted, provided crucial documentation. This shows the importance of press freedom and congressional oversight in creating accountability for torture, though it also shows the limits of that accountability when prosecutions don't follow. The question of what should be done now, how contemporary Americans should respond to the history of the water cure and the reality of waterboarding, has several dimensions. First, historical honesty requires acknowledging that torture happened, that it was systematic, and that it was wrong. This means teaching about the water cure in schools, including it in history textbooks, ensuring that Americans understand this aspect of their history. Second, legal accountability requires enforcing laws against torture without exception. The lack of prosecution for waterboarding sets a dangerous precedent. Future administrations need to know that torture will result in criminal prosecution, not just political controversy. Third, institutional reform requires changing the cultures and structures that enable torture, which means training interrogators in effective non-torture techniques, creating robust whistleblower protections, and ensuring that medical personnel and lawyers understand their ethical obligations not to participate in torture. Fourth, moral reckoning requires serious reflection on how a nation founded on principles of human dignity can fall into torture, and what that reveals about the gap between American ideals and American practice. Some might argue that discussing the water cure and waterboarding is unpatriotic, that it dishonors American soldiers and helps America's enemies. This argument fundamentally misunderstands patriotism. Real patriotism means holding your country to its highest ideals, not defending every action your country takes. Real patriotism means wanting your country to learn from its mistakes rather than repeat them. Real patriotism means insisting that American soldiers and officials follow the law and respect human rights, because when they don't, they dishonor themselves and their country. Being honest about torture doesn't help America's enemies. Using torture helps America's enemies by giving them propaganda tools and moral high ground. Being honest about torture is the first step toward ensuring it doesn't happen again. The soldiers who used the water cure in the Philippines were products of their time and circumstance. They weren't monsters. They were mostly ordinary young men who found themselves in a brutal situation with inadequate guidance, under pressure to produce results, surrounded by a culture that saw their enemies as subhuman and offered a technique that seemed to work. Understanding this doesn't excuse torture, but it helps explain how torture happens and what's needed to prevent it. It shows that preventing torture requires not just laws but cultural change, moral education, clear guidelines, and institutional structures that make torture difficult and punish it severely when it occurs. It shows that good people can do terrible things in certain circumstances, which means preventing terrible things requires changing the circumstances, not just hoping that people will choose correctly when faced with pressure to torture. The parallels between the water cure in 1900 and waterboarding in 2002 are stark and should be sobering. Same technique, same justifications, same process of gradual normalization, same lack of accountability, same pattern of euphemism and denial. The fact that America used this torture technique twice, a century apart, despite laws against it, despite knowing from the first time that it causes trauma and produces unreliable intelligence, despite prosecuting others for using it, shows how powerfully the temptations of torture persist and how difficult it is to maintain moral and legal prohibitions under pressure. It shows that historical amnesia is dangerous, that forgetting the lessons of the water cure in the Philippines made it easier to repeat the mistake. It shows that constant vigilance is necessary to prevent torture, that the legal and moral prohibitions must be reinforced continually because the circumstances that enable torture, fear, pressure for results, dehumanization of enemies keep recurring. The water cure deserves to be remembered not to create shame, but to create wisdom. It should be taught as a cautionary tale about how torture emerges, how it spreads, how it fails to achieve its goals while creating enormous costs, and how difficult it is to stop once it starts. It should be taught alongside the history of waterboarding in the War on Terror to show the pattern, to demonstrate that this isn't ancient history, but a recurring temptation that America continues to struggle with. And it should be taught as part of a broader education about the realities of warfare, about the gap between the ideals nations profess and the actions they take, about the importance of laws and institutions that constrain power even in times of crisis. The victims of the water cure, Filipino prisoners and civilians who were tortured by American soldiers, deserve to be remembered too. Their names are mostly lost to history. The American military didn't carefully document who was tortured. The Filipino perspective on the water cure was rarely recorded and has mostly been lost. But these were real people who experienced real suffering. They weren't statistics. They were individuals with families, with hopes, with lives that were shattered by torture. Remembering them means acknowledging their humanity, recognizing that they were victims of injustice, and committing to ensuring that others don't suffer the same fate. It means understanding that torture isn't an abstract policy question, but a reality of human suffering, that debates about enhanced interrogation techniques are really debates about whether to inflict terrifying, agonizing experiences on human beings, and that the answer to that question should always be no.